Okay, good evening, everybody. This was, by the way, my favorite line. Turn your phones off and not just keep them on quiet, turn them off. This way no one will be able to take a glimpse on their BlackBerry. It's great to be with Tariq Ali again. We were just chatting downstairs that on November 8th, the morning after Obama was elected, I was hosting Tariq on Real TV program by the name of Empire. And some of the team member tried to pin down what he had to say then so we can pin him down and say, you see, you said that. But actually he was too careful and probably pretty intelligent about everything he said, and a lot of it proved to be correct, and which we'll try to revisit tonight. The reason I'm here, being the senior political analyst for Al Jazeera and the host of the program Empire, has a special relevance. You see, anyone of importance could have introduced Tariq Ali being the dashing figure of the 1960s, you know, the handsome man who led the demonstrations, or being the novelist or the filmmaker, or writing the trilogy on Pakistan and so on and so forth. But what interests me, and what I hope will interest us tonight about Tariq Ali, is the person who consistently throughout those 4 or 5 decades has spoken and has written back to empire. He's the one who probed, who questioned power, whether in his home country of Pakistan, here, or throughout the world. I think Tariq was in many ways the person who has written brilliantly and spoken outspokenly. Spoken outspokenly, is that allowed? Against empire, which of course brings us to his book. So let me give you a bit of a format about where we're heading as I understand it tonight. I think we have about an hour and a half. We will divide it, I was told half by half, but I think we'll probably be more than enough just to do a third or a quarter here between Tariq and I, and then we'll turn it to you. We will try not to ramble on, as I am now. We'll give you 30 seconds to 1 minute to make a point or to ask a question and the likes. The book is The Obama Syndrome, Surrender at Home, War Abroad. Very relevant, considering the results of the midterm elections and perhaps the opening towards a new era in the United States. Okay, so having said all of that, Tariq, let me start where you start in the book. You say this is a report. It's not exactly a scorecard, is it? It's more of a perspective, more of a critique, if you will.
Yeah, it is. Essentially, I mean, the argument of the book is that there are two things one has to understand about Obama and the last election. One, that whatever you might think of him politically, and I'm a strong critic, nonetheless, for the United States, a country in which African Americans have been on the bottom rung of the ladder forever, it is not unimportant that a mixed-race president married to an Afro-American woman, and part of that society, is elected to the White House. Now, when I made this point in the States once, an African-American intellectual got up and said, well, yeah, that is quite interesting, but he's not the first one to have risen high. He's the first one to become president, so that is now over and done with. And obviously the point my friend was making in D.C. was that the Republicans have got people who have risen quite high. Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, not to mention Judge Clarence Thomas, a former Black Panther. I don't know how many knew that. Very, very militant in his past. They all rose to high positions under the Republican administration. So we should talk about politics, not color. Which is a fair enough point, I guess, but nonetheless, it is an important factor which shouldn't be underestimated. But that's now over and done with, and what one notices in the States, Marwan, where you go often, that the honeymoon period afforded this president was very limited, the most abbreviated in my memory, and that has nothing to do with his color or anything. That has to do with the fact that his election coincided with the most grave and serious economic crisis to hit that country and hit the Wall Street system since 1929. And a lot was expected, and many thought that he would now break with the past. Yes, we can do something new, all the hope that had been aroused, and he didn't do it. And that is where the disjuncture comes in. And not only didn't he continue the economic policies that had led to the disaster, which is happening here too, by the way, but on the promises that had been made. He never promised to change the Wall Street system, to be fair to him, but he did promise to change the assault on civil liberties that was taking place, to close down Guantanamo, and to bring to an end, he said, what had shamed America abroad. None of that has been done. And Harold Koh, the big lawyer who he knows, who's a close friend, who he appointed to the State Department, recently went public, recently some months ago, and defended drone attacks in Pakistan as being within the law. So on civil liberties, he's been a big disappointment. On education, he's been a big disappointment. On health, he made what many regard as a shoddy compromise. And on the main issue of the day, you have in 2009 a big increase in the disparity of wealth, in the fact that the 1% of the country's richest people have doubled their income already in 2009, at a time when you have foreclosures and 14 to 15 million people out of work. And that, I think, is what has created the anger and the loss of hope and the huge loss of the midterms. Now, midterm losses are not new in the States. The incumbent, whoever it is, suffers, but the suffering is usually to the tune of 40 seats. This time it's 63 in the House of Representatives. So it's a huge figure from that point of view, and there we are.
So let's take them one by one, some of these disappointments with broken promises. Again, to be fair to President Obama, if we read on foreign policy,
yeah,
and on domestic, let's start with domestic healthcare. John Judis writes in the New Republic, one of the more liberal and yet not exactly friendly to the Obama types, even turning more or less new conservative in the last 8 years, writes that there was a quiet revolution under Obama. That under Obama there were such regulations on the question of environment, on the questions of health, on the question of securities, and so on and so forth, that in fact he is to be given credit on rolling back much of the deregulations that happened under Reagan and even under Clinton and Bush W.
Well, some of the deregulation had to be rolled back given the scale of the crisis. How could you not? I mean, you know, even a Republican president, not Palin, but a moderate Republican president would have been forced to roll back some of the deregulation because the country was crying out for it. You can't make these huge bailouts to Wall Street running into trillions and not have some regulation. But the fact is that it really isn't enough, and it doesn't go further.
And on healthcare, you say that, of course, that lifts much to criticism, but if the midterm elections is telling us something, is that people thought, and now he's apparently admitting, that perhaps he's bulldozed his way on healthcare, and perhaps America, unlike Europe, is not actually keen in this, nationalization of the wealth of the healthcare system.
Well, you see, what is very interesting is that if you study opinion polls in the United States just before Reagan came to power, you have every single opinion poll showing between 70 to 80% of the American population saying they wanted a healthcare system like existed in most parts of Europe. Then you had the big deregulations during the Reagan era, where the entire ideological weaponry of the state was turned. And so the ratings for a healthcare system free at the point of production, like in most parts of Europe, went slightly down, but not all that down. One reason for the big hostility to the healthcare reforms, even from the poor, who will gain from them, by the way, to a certain extent, is that it insists, the healthcare reforms insist, that every single person who is going to benefit from them has to be part of an insurance deal, which is not the case with Medicare at the moment. So that means that if you have no money or you're very poor, you will probably be given state aid after you fill 50 forms and given the help to join an insurance company. And that is what people are regretting, that all these insurance companies will be competing each other to make profits. And people are very nervous about that. So when you had opinion polls saying a single payer system, the actual votes were quite high. And it's the capitulation and the confusion. And look, before the campaign started in earnest, Obama was for a single payer system for the National Health Service. Once the campaign started and the lobbyists began to get closer and closer, the insurance lobbyists, one of whom drafted this bill, and the pharmaceutical lobbyists, who gave lots of money to his campaign and to other senators on both sides, he began to cave in more and more. But having said that, he couldn't even defend his own health reform, whatever he was pushing through, insufficient though it is, in the face of the Tea Party attacks. And the Tea Party attacks were carried out by people who couldn't muster more than 500 or 600 in town halls, who got enormous publicity on Fox television, were lifted beyond the realm of reality into a fantastical world, but their numbers weren't so big. And Obama and his colleagues tell us that we have 13 million online supporters, which MoveOn.org started the base of, which we've got online. 13 million? Well, why didn't you mobilize 1/13 of them then? Just 1/13, and say, look, come out for us in Washington, D.C. and defend us. No. And that is a big, big problem with him. Now he'll cave in even more, I fear, after the midterm results.
Okay, so you assume, you presume that he was bulldozed from the right, but you keep giving him the benefit of the doubt that he actually at one point stood for certain things, and then he more or less, let's say, to put it kindly to him, compromised on it, probably in a major way.
Yeah, but you know, I would say the same about a moderate Republican. Which is what he is. There's no big difference between him and a moderate Republican. You know, we are now, we've had these Tea Party people boosted up. I mean, the most nutty ones amongst them didn't win. You know, what's her name? O'Donnell and Sharon Angle. Both lost out because people weren't prepared to vote for them.
Nevada and Delaware.
Yeah.
But in the more central parts of the country, there is an understanding that this president, and this is where probably the nuance is between us, some of the people on the outside, and some of the people within the country itself. How much are you, or have you built in terms of your expectations, or some of us, our illusions, on the presidency and a president's capacity to change a country like America?
Well, I think lots of people did have illusions. Probably, yeah, no, I was going to say probably more outside than inside, but that is not exactly the case. Probably the same. I mean, Europe was desperate for a president who was not Bush. And who can blame them? But, you know, they didn't mind if the president did the same things as long as he said so nicely. And they got that. But within the United States, there was, you know, there was real hope and illusion. I mean, I was in that country for many months, you know, with breaks during the election campaign. And the mobilization of young people for this president, I've not seen that in Europe for a very long time. Young people between the ages of 18, 25, actually engaged in politics, discussing politics, talking about politics. And they're the ones, and within the African American population as well, hope that something would be done. And these are the layers that are most disappointed. And it's not the case, if you look at the election results, the midterm results closely, a tiny minority have voted for the other side, but by large, most of the people who supported Obama did, not most, but it was people, his supporters staying at home that created such a disastrous result for him, which means that they are disappointed. Now, the second part of your question, what can a single president do? Look, a lot more than he's done. But you have to be prepared to fight. I mean, Obama in his book said he wanted to be like Reagan, speak for the whole of America. I mean, whether Reagan spoke for the whole of America is open to debate, but he certainly created that impression. And as we know, mostly, I mean, it's not a big secret in the United States that essentially he was quite dim and the country was run by a U.S. equivalent of a Politburo throughout the entire Reagan era, who pushed through measures because they used him. He was an actor, and they used him. But in any case, they got things through, they moved the country to the right, they did all that. Now, what we needed from the other side was a president and his cabinet which were prepared to go and argue the case and fight politically against the right. And that he didn't do, and that's a mistake, because there's no excuse for it's not often that the Democrats have a majority in the Senate and the House and a Democrat president. Here they had it. Now, if you say this to some of them, they say, yeah, but there are lots of blue dog Democrats, Democrats who are really Republicans. But, then you put them under pressure. And you put them under pressure by threatening them, like Roosevelt used to do.
But, Tariq, is the comparison fair between the Reaganism and Obamacanism, or whatever you want to call it, in the sense that Reagan was rooting for the powerful in the country, while Obama was expected to root against the powerful of the country.
Yeah, but you can, in a situation where there was great public anger against the rich, the very rich in American society because of the crisis, the total collapse of that system. And in a society which is completely, we are told, hostile to state interventions, the American elite quite calmly called on the state to use taxpayers' money to bail out rich bankers. And there was a lot of anger at the bailing out of the rich. So you add to that anger the fact that he had majorities. A lot more could have been done if the political will had been there, and it's this political will, in my opinion, that was lacking.
But isn't that easier said than done, in the sense that, in the end of the day, aren't we talking about a capitalist system that is going to, that where the banking system is an indispensable requirement, and that you have a president who was faced with either the economy breaking down or not, and he had to intervene?
Yeah, but, we've had a capitalist system in the United States forever. It was nothing else, and it is not the case. I mean, if you look at the figures now, the wealth figures, it's quite an interesting comparison. In 1915, when they first started using statistics, 1% of the country's richest people owned 15% of its wealth. Today, 1% of the country's richest people own 24% of the country's wealth. In between this, it was not always like this. During the New Deal, wealth disparities went down. Why? Because the state intervened. And look, if you look at the latest New York Review of Books, I mean, my saying this might seem very radical. Actually, it isn't that radical. It's just sort of common sense for the capitalist layers in that society to do it. If you look at George Soros's article in the latest New York Review, I mean, this is not a radical guy, but he is quite intelligent, and he certainly knows much more than I do about the movement of money in commodities. And he is arguing, correctly in my opinion, that the big problem with the stimulus that they gave to the banks was that this stimulus was designed to aid consumption. Whereas he argued the stimulus should have been tied to state projects like took place under the New Deal, like the construction of dams, the constructions, he gave other examples. But he said, in order to do this, the government, instead of just bailing these wretched banks out, he's very critical of them, Soros. What they should have done was to have taken equity in the banks, i.e., what he's essentially arguing from in his own way is nationalize them and then use them to rebuild the country. Now, this is not a guy who by any remote stretch of the imagination, could be described as being left-wing or radical. Yeah. But so there were these people. Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz was advising, not as sharply as Soros, but saying more or less similar things. Krugman, another economist, was saying very, very similar things. So there were choices, but Obama went against that. And one reason he went against that is because the bulk of the money given to him for the campaign came from Wall Street. Obama raised more money than Hillary Clinton or McCain from Wall Street.
I would like to turn to foreign policy before we turn it to our friends in here. But I want to just pick up on this point shortly. So you think this is smart? He's a political operator, that's how you become president of the United States, or you take that against him, that he takes money from various countries in order to become president and hence effect change from within or from above?
But I mean, I think, the thing is, essentially, I think he is a very clever machine politician. He was created by the Chicago machine, which is very brilliant at this sort of work. And from early days, in terms of who he was going to offend and who he wasn't going to offend, he was very clear he wasn't going to offend the bankers or the Wall Street system.
But isn't also the other side of Obama that Remnick talks about when he has a 600-page pedigree of Obama and the family and so on and so forth, and talks about how this guy was really on the streets of Chicago in 1992, demonstrating and bringing people under the so-called Vote Project in order to roll back everything about the Reagan economics and so-called voodoo economics and so on.
Well, I mean, Remnick says some things and he doesn't say other things. I mean, in this book, I quote from Bobby Rush, senior black lead Democratic Party leader, African-American, former Black Panther, who describes what happened in the Illinois Parliament when they were pushing through cuts in Chicago, the Republicans. And he describes it very clearly. He said this young, new Illinois Senator Obama was sitting next to me, because he said we all sat together. And he describes very clearly. He says, as the cuts were being pushed through, we were all voting against them, all of us from Chicago in the poorest areas in Chicago, and Obama was voting for them. So we went up to him and said, what the hell do you think you're doing? You represent Chicago. And he said, no, we have to show fiscal prudence, and voted for the cuts. Still, suddenly he realized that the district he represented was going to be cut too, and at that point he started freaking out. And when they then said to him, but you didn't vote, for the whole city, he actually, the only time, I think, in his life, he sort of said to him, come out and I'll show you, and there were fisticuffs.
Let's move from fiscal responsibility to responsibility in foreign policy, or irresponsibility in foreign policy. So Bob Woodward came out with his book recently on Obama, and one of the things I've noticed, Tariq, is that in every single discussion for months on, Obama was the person, and then through him, Biden, Eckenberry, as you actually say in your book too, they were standing against the military, against the generals. And he tried, commander-in-chief or not, commander-in-speech or not, but he actually tried his best throughout the process on the war in Afghanistan, also on the war on terms of the redeployment out of Iraq, to stand up to the generals. And that apparently it's not an easy thing for a Democrat, liberal, if you will, and so on and so forth, to stand up for the generals.
Well, look, here again, I think Woodward exaggerates. If you look at Obama in Afghanistan, Pakistan, one thing that distinguished Obama's campaign from McCain on Afghanistan, Pakistan, AFPAC as he termed it, was that he said if he was elected, he was going to escalate the war. He said it. Here there's no betrayal or any nonsense like that. Very clear, we need a surge, we will send more troops. Bush hasn't paid sufficient attention to this part of the world, and we're going to do it. Iraq was a bad war, this is a good war. Very clear line coming out from Obama to show that he was tough, and many of his supporters were saying, oh, you know, we have to do this to just show we're not sort of namby-pamby. It never works like that. So he's elected president, and he has to take decisions. And for the first time in my memory, there's a semi-public debate within the military on do we need more troops or not, with Petraeus saying we need more troops, and Eikenberry, the General Eikenberry, who actually was the boss of Petraeus and McChrystal when they were young officers. Eikenberry says we really don't need more troops in Afghanistan. This is not going to work. That is not the problem. Now, Obama had to decide who, and it wasn't that all the generals were unified.
But he wasn't general. I mean, he was ambassador when he said all these things.
He was an ambassador who has huge support and respect inside the Pentagon. He's a general, you know, I mean, he's a former general, but I mean, the links never die. So the very distinguished former general who's the ambassador saying, don't escalate the war. Don't escalate it here or in Pakistan. And making very sane points. A Marine officer, intelligence Marine officer, resigned in public after the escalation. Petraeus and McChrystal said, escalate, we need these troops. And Obama here now said he could have gone to the public, as I'm told Biden advised him to, made a broadcast to the nation saying, I'm receiving conflicting advice, and after discussing with General Eikenberry in Kabul, I'm of the opinion we shouldn't send more troops. He didn't. He did the opposite. He backed the surge. And then the figures are quite stunning. That since the 2 years Obama has been in power, there have been more drone attacks in Pakistan than in the entire 8 years when Bush was in office. Just a fact. So a decision is taken to escalate, and now they're in trouble again.
And apparently he's escalating in the entire region. Tariq, it seems that Obama has taken the decision that counterterrorism is going to be a question of taking these covert operations in the overall Middle East. You think that's going to bode well for him in the next 2 years?
I don't think it is. I mean, you know, you would have hoped that a Democrat president would have learned the lessons of what's been going on since 9/11. That this business can't be ended by force and violence, and that what was needed in the Middle East is exactly the opposite.
But he did that in the Cairo speech, right? And in the Istanbul speech?
The Cairo speech was you know, I've read that speech very carefully, Marwan. You know, it's what the Cairo speech is a change in mood music. It doesn't say anything concretely. Its mood music is different. Assalamu alaikum, you know.
He did have us on Assalamu alaikum, didn't he?
So nothing happened. In fact, on Israel, he has been much tougher on the Palestinians, so that even a Bush administration guy 2 weeks ago said, you know, he should have been much tougher on the Israelis.
But he did ask to freeze the settlements.
But you know, every American president over the last 20 years, when elected president, the first thing he says is, we want peace, the Palestinians should stop doing what they're doing, and the Israelis should freeze the settlements. For 25 years now, this is a regular routine, and it's a joke, because the settlements are freezed for a tiny bit and then they start again. And Obama, they actually insulted more than they'd insulted Bush, because when they did this with Bush Sr., W's father, he said, you sons of bitches, I'll deal with you, and he put sanctions on them, if you remember. But
you think now it's going to get worse under a Republican majority in Congress?
I think it'll be the same, essentially, that they will do what the Israelis want done in that region. Trample all over the Palestinians, which is what they're doing. And the so-called international community, by which you mean the EU and Washington, will sort of say, fine, that's fine. I mean, what they've done in Palestine is a disgrace. No one talks about it that much. But it's an absolute disgrace what's been going on in Palestine and what the West has done and not done in that region.
Do you agree, Tariq, that Obama is not exactly as friendly, as loving, as warm towards Europe as his predecessors? Well, since we're in London, I mean, we must ask the question. Is he as... is there this feeling, you agree, that he actually doesn't give a damn about Europe?
I don't think, you know, look, they all need Europe as an ally, permanent ally. And the Europeans serve that role, by and large. There was a slight division on Iraq when the Germans and the French said, no, this is one step too far. But the minute Iraq was occupied, they came on board and said, okay, we were opposed to the invasion, but now that it's occupied, we'll support the occupation.
I want to ask one last question before we move to the thing, and it's a tricky question, Tariq. So you end the book, I don't know whoever among you read the book. Tariq ends the book with a citation by the infamous Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, who at one point, as he's known in Washington to be a very, what's a good word for it? Vulgar. Chicago-like thing. He says, he accuses the leftist critic, like Tariq and others, but in America, of being, if I might use it, fucking retards. And then Tariq decides to turn the table and he says, but guess who is the fucking retards? So you think the administration is?
Well, no, I said let's wait till the midterms, which Emanuel was masterminding. And after there's a defeat for these, for the administration's policies, then we can pose the question again, who are the retards? Or the effing retards.
Okay.
And Rahm Emanuel is now run off to Chicago. He's left the White House.
He's going to hopefully or not be mayor. Okay, let's turn to you. See who you think is retard and who's not. Please. Well, you need to wait for the microphone.
Zafar Iqbal here. I read in the New York Times today, there's an article by Arundhati Roy.
Yeah. Could you speak closer to the mic?
Yeah. She talks about human rights, and she cites Kashmir as one issue, apart from other human rights. And she criticizes Obama whilst she is there, that he has not done so many things, whether it's Palestine or Guantanamo Bay and this one in Kashmir. What is your view on that point?
Well, I think she's a very courageous woman, Arundhati Roy, and she's a friend, and you know, she's lives in a country where it's not easy sometimes to say these things, and she's attacked for it. At one point, they threatened to arrest her and charge her with sedition for going to Kashmir and saying in public that it's obvious to anyone who comes to Kashmir that the Kashmiri people don't now want to be part of India. Well, you know, this is not news anymore. Everyone knows this. And, I mean, you know, just to give you a slight flavor of the mood in that in Kashmir, the last time, they've now stopped playing cricket matches, and you know the whole country is cricket mad. They don't play cricket matches there because once, about 25 years ago, the West Indies played India in a test match, and the West Indies won. And Viv Richards, the West Indian captain, said, I have never received such a response anywhere. They put me on their shoulders and took me around because we defeated India. So since then, no more cricket was played. And that means everyone knows what the mood of the people is. And you have had in Kashmir, over the years, 200,000 paramilitary units and soldiers keeping the people down. And it's hardly discussed. You know, you have a rebellion in Tibet and the whole media goes for it. But what has been happening in Kashmir is much, much worse than anything that has happened in Tibet.
She makes this point that
you need the microphone. You need the microphone.
Obama is there at the moment, and he made no mention of that.
Well, but you know, Obama essentially, you know, you have to understand that American presidents and European leaders, when they visit large countries in the East and countries whose economy is booming, these are largely business trips. They go to rustle up money and
$10 billion worth of contract, apparently.
Yeah, it's a contractor's trip, and that they've made. How many contracts?
$10 billion.
$10 billion. That's the reason of the trip. So why would you upset the government by raising subjects which they don't want to be raised when all you're interested in is a business.
But isn't it too much also to, like the British Prime Minister, once again, Obama, picks on Pakistan in India? What's up with that? Why do you keep going to India and picking on Pakistan?
It's to please the larger country. But you know, there's quite funny. I mean, I read a few days ago a report that, which unusually, nothing that happens in China on the foreign policy front, it's very difficult to put your hands on it because they're very discreet. They don't talk publicly. But this was quite astonishing. Some Chinese scholar made it public. He said that the Americans were putting a lot of pressure on us and saying, why do you defend Pakistan against this and that, and why do you do this? And he said, we just shut them up by saying, okay, you should understand this. Pakistan is our Israel.
Please, go ahead.
He said no one replied.
Tariq Ali, thank you very much for your eloquence and erudite presentation. You've presented a particular, I would say, left-wing or possibly extreme left-wing point of view, based in part on fact and in part on assumptions. But there is another perception. It could be argued, as far as foreign policy is concerned, that Obama is actually quite confrontational with the traditional allies of the United States. In particular, for example, with Poland and Czechoslovakia, he metaphorically kicked them in a tender place between the legs when he removed the missile defense system from them, which had been previously agreed. Similarly with the Israelis, he's kicked them between the legs by reneging on previous agreements with them. He's insulted most Europeans because most Europeans now feel that they're not loved anymore because there are many other places which are priorities for Obama. He has made statements in Istanbul. He's made statements in Cairo. And today he's made statements in Indonesia extending the hand of friendship to 1.2 billion Muslims. None of these gestures have been reciprocated. One of the reasons, apparently, is that these are seen as signs of weakness on Obama's part. And in fact, all his diplomacy in that respect has garnered exactly zero. Now, this contrasts markedly.
Can we let Tariq respond to that? Because you had a point well made.
Well, I mean, you know, I wouldn't call George Soros's criticism of the American economy a far-left criticism. Oh, in foreign policy. But, you know, the problem in foreign policy is that it's not the habit anymore to make too many criticisms because we all agree, except people who make the criticisms nonetheless. I mean, if you look at this country where we all live, the majority of the people in Britain, 70% according to opinion polls, want the troops out of Afghanistan. 70%. Yet all the three political parties representing these people in Parliament are for the war. And the same can be said about virtually every single European country today. It's that the elites and the ideologues who support them and defend their policies in the mainstream media actually are out of touch with what people feel. This is not even just Western Europe. All the opinion polls in the Eastern European countries who've sent troops to Afghanistan, because the number of troops may be small, but many countries are represented, are opposed to it. The big ones too. So, you know, what is this about the far left? It's a normal thing to say that countries which are fighting wars which are unjust should not be fighting these wars. On Israel, you're completely wrong. You know, I mean, it's hardly a secret what Obama is doing in that country. Are you giving backing to that regime? So,
go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. My question to you is basically...
Could you speak into the mic? Yeah.
My question to you basically is, Do you not think that perhaps Obama has veered a little bit to the right, or to more Republican ideals, is more as a direct result of the kind of accusations put against him during the election campaign? For instance, that lots of people were saying, like, oh, he was Muslim, as though this was a horrible accusation, or that he was very pro, Arab or so on because of his background. So do you not think that he has something to prove to a very predominantly right-wing American electorate?
I don't think that's the case. I mean, all sorts of people on the fringes of American politics say all sorts of things about Democrat presidents. This is not a new thing, and it doesn't just apply to Obama. I mean, if you look, you can start with Kennedy and Johnson. Whenever a Democratic Party politician, a Democrat, is president, you have the extreme right fringes of the United States becoming very active. The John Birch Society, even the Ku Klux Klan against Lyndon Johnson when he was pushing through under massive pressure from below reforms, against Carter, against Clinton, though Clinton they targeted on personal issues, massive campaign to impeach Clinton. So this is part of the paranoid style of American politics. And against Obama, very similar people use what they can against him. What they play on his weaknesses. But you can override these, and the other presidents more or less did by being extremely tough on these people and their supporters and fighting back. And you don't pander to them. Whenever you decide to fight a war on your enemy's ground, you suffer. It benefits the enemy. That's a basic rule in politics.
Go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering what, if anything, you thought Obama had done well, and then a sort of second question. Do you think that the checks and balances inherent in the American political system are in any way to blame for the perceived failures of the administration so far?
Well, I mean, what has Obama done well? I honestly, been apart from presentation, which compared to the previous government is good. I can't think of anything concretely that I could say is a sort of huge step forward. I'm told by friends in D.C. and New York that some of the low-grade appointments within the have been good. I'm prepared to believe that. I don't know if that's true or not, but fine. But where it really matters, nothing much is done. As to the system, political system in the United States, there's been a big debate since the state was founded, whether to go for a presidential system in which the president is increasingly treated like a monarch, de facto, despite the fact that there are checks on his powers, or whether to have a parliamentary system. And I mean, I know many think Gore Vidal, for instance, is a very strong opponent of the presidential system and says it's a big problem. And then you have other, I think, fundamental problems now, which are coming to the fore in the U.S. Constitution, where the number of small states in that country have similar weight in the electoral vote as huge states. I mean, where it's not a one-person, one-vote system, which I think it should become, and that would democratize it further. But then there's another problem. If you look at one of the most distinguished political philosophers in modern America, who's still with us, very old now, Sheldon Wolin at Princeton, who has been writing about the American political system, great political philosopher. His last book is a real cry of anguish from the heart. It's called Democracy, Inc. And he says that essentially all our politicians, not just Democrats or Republicans, anyone who now comes into politics is from day one seduced by the corporations and corporate money. And he is extremely worried that the more this goes on, the less people will vote, and the system will implode.
Let's start from the back and we move to the front. Go ahead. Yes.
It's Tariq Ali. When he was running against Hillary Clinton,
Yeah.
were you sceptical when he was running against McCain and Palin were sceptical. What was your turning point? When you did you suddenly think, I imagine suddenly think, Obama is not going to deliver?
To be
Question.
it was, I was, to be frank with you, always fairly skeptical on the big issues. I hoped that he might, on civil liberties, actually stop this business that is going on, where people can be picked up and renditioned. You know what rendition is. You're either taken to Guantanamo or taken to Bagram prison near Kabul, which is a real chamber of horrors, by the way. I mean, compared to Bagram, Guantanamo is a luxury resort. So nothing on that front has been done.
But we have, for example, his bigger appointments, a point where you thought maybe, well, that doesn't really look good.
I thought that the appointment, say, to the Supreme Court would be, shift the balance in the Supreme Court. It hasn't done. I mean, the person he's appointed is, probably the most reactionary person he could find at that level to appoint, who has defended and said when she was Attorney General that she wasn't going to stop renditioning. We can go, the guy Harold Coe was defending drone attacks which led to lots of civilian deaths in Pakistan. No problem at all.
Gates and Clinton?
The appointments. And Gates, appointing Gates to keeping on Bush's defense secretary at the Pentagon. I mean, that was the clearest indication of continuity. Hillary Clinton had to be given something. And she demanded the Secretary of State. Actually, I always thought he'd have been better advised to push her to become a Supreme Court judge. And I'm not kidding. She would have been much, much better at that.
So, in a nutshell, it was post-election, not pre-election.
Well, no, I think he was at his best when he was campaigning against Hillary Clinton. But once he had to campaign against McCain, he moved. I mean, he moved a tiny bit. Huh?
Once he campaigned with Hillary Clinton.
Yes, and against the Republicans, he shifted. When he was taking on Clinton, he was at his best.
Leon Ferguson, Al Jazeera. Tariq, Obama may have been a disappointment, but surely he's better than Bush.
He's better looking than Bush. I agree with you on that. And he speaks better, and he's more intelligent. I'm not interested in these. I mean, they're interesting qualities. And, if I was given a choice of having dinner with Bush or Obama, without any doubt at all, I would choose Obama, because one could actually talk to him about the state of the world and ideas and all that. He's a very intelligent guy. And that goes without saying. But I'm more interested not in what politicians say, but by what they do. And here, and I cite chapter and verse in my book, I will tell you all the continuities with the previous administration. So that people who were saying that the Bush regime is aberrant, it's nothing, it's a big breach with the United States, they were unpleasant the way they did it. Because Bush didn't soften the blow when he was going to do these things, as his predecessors had done and as his successor is doing. But Bush and Cheney just went for it. And, they said, if you don't like it, sod off. Whereas these guys are a bit more cultivated and cultured, but the aims are not so different, which is the preservation and protection of the American imperium.
So shall we just move from the back to the front, perhaps? Go ahead, yes. And then, sir.
Hi, Mr. Ali. If I can, I think perhaps all of us can take something away from your book and your lecture. I think that there's obviously a large growing presence of the left within the U.S., but there just doesn't seem to be any means of actuating that. And perhaps that's what has caused Mr. Obama to not act on those things. He simply doesn't have a reason to. But a lot of times it's difficult to see from over here in Europe.
Well, I mean, there's an element of truth, of course, in what you say. But, you're elected by a majority. You've got majorities in the House and the Senate. if you want to, you can push through certain things and you can take on your enemies. But if you're saying that had there been a huge mass movement in the United States to push him, I agree with you. That would have been much better. It's an open question whether it would have succeeded, but nonetheless, it's always good when there's pressure from below. And that pressure from below could have been encouraged, actually, from the top. And that is what he chose not to do.
But when he became president, Tariq?
But you know, if the Republican Party is fighting against you by organizing demonstrations and setting up kooky groups and all this sort of stuff, you have to do no, you don't set up kooky groups, but you organize your own support against them. Obviously, that's politics.
Marshall Guntz, by the way, the leader of the movement that made Obama possible, said recently that one thing is to lead demonstrations in the streets. Another thing is to effect change in a system that is resistant to change.
But you know, normally that is true. But when you have such a huge economic crisis and the entire country is suffering, then a president can do something that Roosevelt used to do, which is to talk directly to the people. Roosevelt's fireside chats were precisely designed to go over the head of Congress and Senate, talk to the people and use them politically to force the Senate and the House to do what he wanted to do. And this was a cripple, a guy who was weak but with enormous self-confidence and some political ideas of which way he wanted to go. I mean, if you read the 1936 election manifesto of the Democratic Party, you can get it online. Just try and read it. You'll be stunned. People say, is this the same Democratic Party? Well, it isn't the same, but the traditions are there.
Hi. I'm here.
Hi.
You've said essentially that Obama didn't have the strength of conviction or the stomach to fight for the platform on which he was elected. Can I ask, do you think the American people have the stomach for the sort of deep structural changes that are required to get the economy back on track?
Well, I never said that. I said Obama didn't even propose these measures. But I think people now, you know, it's quite grim in large parts of the states. Foreclosures, people losing their homes, people out of jobs. I mean, often when people look at America, they think it's just New York or Los Angeles or D.C. Actually, D.C.'s in a bad way too. But they just look at these places. So that when other parts of the country suffer, the news doesn't get through. But it's certainly getting through to the president now, given what's happened in the midterms and where he lost. He lost his own state, Illinois, from where he'd been elected as senator. He's lost that. So it's why. And his supporters talk openly on television. I mean, I was there a few weeks ago, before the midterms, doing the book tour there, and there was this amazing confrontation which one of the networks had organized. Discussion on television, and you know where the audience is carefully selected, which the BBC does on Question Time regularly. And they had some African Americans in the audience, and this woman got up and took Obama on, much to his surprise and everyone's surprise. And she said, "I'm fed up of defending you." And she explained why. And, you know, I got that from people in D.C. when I was speaking there. A large number of African Americans said, if you had said these things, what you're saying now, 6 months ago, we'd have been fighting and arguing with you. And I said, now they said, unfortunately, you're right, and we agree. But, you know, even now we don't like saying it. Now, the question is, given the scale of the crisis, if he had pushed through certain radical measures and explained why, I think many, many Americans would have bought it.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes, you've been very critical of the corrupt Pakistani government and the venality of President Zardari.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that Pakistan has a lot of influence on the situation in Afghanistan. If I could ask you, however reluctant you might be to put yourself in President Obama's position, assuming you have withdrawn from Afghanistan, how would you want to engage with the Pakistani government, given they are the people that you'll be having to deal with? What would you be asking them to do, or would you have nothing to do with them at all?
Well, it's a difficult question because, you know, the thought of someone like me ever being the head of the American empire is in itself a joke, but okay, I know what you're saying. Well, look, I have argued in my books on Pakistan and in the New Left Review and other places where I write that if an American president, Bush or Obama, decided on an exit strategy from Afghanistan, the best way to have done this, it might be too late for that now, would have been to involve the regional powers, i.e. Iran, Russia, don't underestimate the Russians, China, and Pakistan, so that it wasn't exclusively Pakistan, but also the other powers, and to ask them, say to them openly, we're going to get out of there. But we need you guys to set up some stable national government, control it for 10 years, and for the Chinese to rebuild the country. Can be done, but they didn't go down that route because they don't want to lose an instrument in that region. And their preferred instrument in that region traditionally has been the Pakistan military. Whoever the president, from 1951 to now, they prefer to use the Pakistani military to do their dirty business, if they have to do it. India, now they're getting very close to, but that would be a huge provocation to bring them in a big way to run them. They can't do it. So because now the situation is so bad, I mean, for 2 years now, the United States has been talking secretly to the insurgents and their leaders. It's not even a secret, as is British intelligence. Those guys say we are prepared to be part of an national government, but not while foreign troops are based on our soil, and who can blame them? But their strength is growing with each passing day. And all this nonsense we get, you know, things are getting better, we've controlled this town, 6 months later, that control has been lost completely. Or we are training an independent Afghan army. Whenever they do that and say this in public, within weeks of this statement being made, one of the guys being trained turns his guns on them and shoots them to say, don't go too far by saying you're training a new Afghan army. It's us. We're the same people. So they haven't been able to divide the majority of that population like they succeeded in doing in Iraq. From that point of view, they're never going to win. Whether they can now whether they even want to push through a different solution, I don't know. I think they're always happier, the Pentagon, when they deal with armies. And this is this is an army-to-army negotiation which goes on all the time.
Please.
You mentioned Iran in passing just now. How likely do you think an attack on Iran in the next 2 years is? And do you take any comfort from the recent reclassification of the Jundullah group?
Of the?
Of the Jundullah group?
Look, I have been often in a minority, even within the sort of left, by saying that I don't think the Americans are going to attack Iran directly. I know they threaten it. And what Bush writes in his memoirs, we seriously considered it. I'm not sure that's totally true. I mean, we had a plan. Well, you have plans for everything. The Pentagon has a plan for dividing up China. I'm not kidding. The Tibet option or the Taiwan option. It's all games. They play these games all the time. So they have a plan, of course, for everything. I mean, they had a plan when the International Court was being set up at The Hague. They actually had a plan that if any American soldier was brought before this tribunal, how they would invade Holland and rescue the prisoner. So when they talk about plans, we can't take it all that seriously. Now, you have to answer the question about Iran, there are two related things. One, why? If you say Iran is not, it's so awful a country, the worst in the world it will become soon, that it can't be allowed nuclear weapons, then you look at North Korea. I mean, there's no question Iran is infinitely more democratic than North Korea on virtually every level. Then you say, but They say, no, but the region is explosive. Well, if the region is explosive, then why don't you withdraw nuclear weapons from Israel? The best way to prevent Iran going nuclear is to denuclearize the whole region. Tell Israel to abandon its nuclear weapons. They don't even admit formally and publicly that they've got them, yet the whole world knows that they've got them. With Iran, you have a situation, it's surrounded by nuclear states. Israel, Pakistan, India, the US fleets that patrol its waters, all armed with nuclear missiles. So it's a bit much to expect them not to do it. I'm not saying that they will. I'm saying that's how they must be thinking. Why us? Okay, let's say that they bomb the nuclear reactors in Iran. These are not all set and conveniently set to become targets in one compound, like the Iraqis had when the Israelis bombed Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactors. These are all over the country. So in order to do that, you will have to carry out huge bombing attacks in which there will be heavy civilian casualties, A. Two, where would the Iranians fight back? They have said it. I was once at a conference in the Gulf, sort of semi-closed conference, and the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran was asked, are you worried by the American threats? And he said, why? He said, we know where we would fight them. We would fight them on 3 different fronts. We would fight them in Iraq. The whole thing will be finished were they to attack us. Lebanon, Afghanistan, and then they said we will retaliate as we see fit on the country that's carried out our attacks, and they know it. Now, a lot of this might be bluff, but the Pentagon doesn't think it's bluff, and they don't want their soldiers killed. I mean, their main priority is keeping American soldiers alive as far as they can and getting them back at some stage. They don't want to have a massive provocation, and often you note military commentators in the United States, when politicians start making these extravagant claims, actually calming them down. So, of course, I don't say it can't happen, because sometimes irrational things happen, like the invasion of Iraq. But this one would be a very serious business for the United States, and the region could spiral out of control were they to do it. So are they going to do it? I doubt it, rather. I doubt it.
Yes. Please, in the back. The back, yes. Lady.
Thanks. A bit of a leading and loaded question, but how far do you think that the American left is actually responsible for the problems that Obama is in now? I mean, it's generally recognized that an American president that during the primaries they have to campaign from the extreme. To gain the presidency, they have to campaign from the center, which is what Obama did. But since he was elected, the expectations of the left have been so high that essentially they've formed an opposition sort of pincer movement with the right. Do you think maybe they should have been a bit more patient?
I mean, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but in America the left barely exists. And to accuse this virtually non-existent left of being unfair to Obama and being responsible for what's going on is a bit grotesque. That's one of the problems in the States, is that you don't have a left. You have never had an organized left since the 20s and 30s. The largest mass political movement in the United States was the Ku Klux Klan. That had more members than Republicans and Democrats put together and multiplied by 50. If you go back into the history of this country, that was the largest mass movement. The left had a presence with Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, but we're now talking about the 20s. At the present moment, the left doesn't exist. What exists are the poor. And you can't blame them for bringing Obama down. They're not. They were the ones who came out and voted for him. And they didn't vote for him in the midterms, and one can't blame them for that. You know, they know that country, they live in it, they suffer in it, and they want a political leader who does a tiny bit for them. They're not even asking for that much. And when they don't even get that tiny bit, they get angry. It's got nothing to do with the left. You know, there's a huge social and economic crisis facing them and facing us, I mean, and facing Europe too.
Yes, please.
Mr. Ali, it's very, from what I understand, it's clear in your opinion that Obama has made mistakes. And I think a large reason for, or I think you believe that a large reason for the Democratic loss, excuse me, was because of voters not getting out of their seats and or pro-Democrats not voting. The question I want to ask though is, how much of an influence do you believe the extreme right-wing media broadcasters, Fox, etc., had on the people?
You see, I'm not one of those, to be frank with you, who believes that the media determines everything. I really am not. And I give you just one tiny example. Not far from North America, you have South America. And in 6 different countries in South America, the media has been totally, 95 to 99% of the media has been hostile to the new parties and new movements which have arisen over the last 10, 15 years. And despite that, these movements have triumphed. So, I mean, Fox, I find them utterly despicable, don't get me wrong. But I don't think it's too easy to blame them. Secondly, if you look at Obama's own interview with Jan Wenner of the Rolling Stone magazine, when he's asked to describe the Tea Party, he's actually quite sober about it. He says there are different strands in the Tea Party. He's very accurate. He says there's one strand which is very angry with us for what we've done in the bailouts. And this is their protest, and I'm actually, you know, I understand their pain. Whether he does or not is different. That, you know, he says that. The second strand, he points out, is a libertarian strand, which bases itself on, it's a very old current, it's not a huge current. They are totally opposed to state intervention in anything, and because of that, they are also opposed to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
As if completely.
Yeah. So they are principled people. And he says that. He says, I don't agree with them, but they're principled. Then he says there is a third layer, which is, he doesn't use that word, but I'm using it, who is slightly loopy and a bit obsessed by the fact that he's non-white, and who go on like that. But that layer has been in American politics for a long, long time. And by the way, the latest information we are getting is that 70% of the activists of the Tea Party, so-called, who were active when the Tea Party was set up, are no longer in it. That Karl Rove and this gang of Republicans who ran Bush's office have taken over the Tea Party. They're using it to get their way here, there, and everywhere. And I'm sure as we approach the next elections, they will try and weed out many, many of the more nutty people on their fringes. I mean, Karl Rove has said he's attacked Sarah Palin quite viciously. To which she, when asked about Rove's attack on her, she replied, "Oh, I don't take the yellow press seriously." But anyway, so that's the aim of the Republican leadership. Get rid of these people and return to mainstream Republicanism, which is right-wing but not nutty.
Tariq, as your fellow leftist and acquaintance of 35 years, I've been trying to wonder how I can totally disagree with you without losing your friendship. The way I'm going to do this is say that the midterms are never the name of the game. It's the next election is the name of the game.
Yeah.
He was always going to take a whack, and I'm sure that Karl Rove is agonized that he didn't win the Senate as well.
Yeah.
I think had he got the Democrats to turn out for him, he would have presented a massive target to Rove, and he would have wiped Obama up completely. I think Obama's surrounded with advisors who survived Carter and Clinton, and they know that you can't get anywhere in the first term without, you have to get to the second term. And I think they're going to get to the second term. I'm sorry to hear you quoting Soros. He collapsed the Thai economy. He's laundering narco money, and he's now bought the human rights movement. He's a totally corrupt man.
Yeah,
and I'm very sad to hear you quote him. I think Obama's greatest tragedy, actually, and I think your comment about the Cairo election speech is very important. I think Obama's hugest tragedy, and I did the affidavits for Vanunu, so I'm no friend of Israel, is what happened in the Iran election. I think everything in the Cairo speech was based on being able to work with the Iranians regionally. And that was an absolutely massive blow to him. And since that moment, I think he's been crippled as a president, actually. I think the fact that he's got George Mitchell working in Palestine is not an appointment of somebody who is not interested. Steve Rapp, the war crimes, is a war crimes ambassador, is one of the most brilliant legal minds and is wanting to work with the ICC. He's been trying to do deals with them. I mean, Obama's a man, we don't know he's going to get to the next term or not.
Okay.
And he's hugely crippled. I think he could have lost the Senate, and I think actually a lot of people think that working with the Republicans, he's actually in a better position trying to work with the Republicans through this next terrible period of 2 years, maybe to position himself to come in, and I hope he does, and I'm sure you and I both hope he does. I actually think Nader would agree with you from the outset that Obama was a dubious character in all of this. I don't think he is. I think he might actually still deliver in a second term.
Good. Well,
he hasn't lost your friendship yet.
No, of course not. But, I mean, I have many American friends who think like that, but that's fine. I don't agree. I mean, I think essentially that, I don't want to sort of go through this again, what things I've been saying, but...
Is this half full, half empty glass kind of argument? Is that what we're going through?
No, it isn't. I think that I think you're wrong. I think we live in a political world where politicians who play this game basically are constrained by many things to do very similar things. I mean, look at this country. Is this coalition government any different from New Labour? All the policies they're pushing through were put into place by New Labour. They're better on some things, on the prison population, for instance. But so the United States, it's been even worse on this level since the Reagan era, that the consensus established by Reagan has not yet been broken. This crisis, my argument was a time when you could have breached that consensus, and he didn't. They decided not to do it. Now, if they do it in the second term, obviously I'll be very happy, but I doubt it. And I don't think that is the way they're going to move. I think they're going to carry on, stumble from one disaster to the other. And if Obama's ratings carry on hitting the ground, or moving in that direction, I mean, they're down quite a lot, it's an open question whether he will be the candidate. It's don't think that the breakfasts at the Clintons these days are not animated. This is not completely impossible, that there will be challenges to him. People will say we can't win with him, and once that you convince Democrats of that, they shift. It's unlikely because it's rare, but Ted Kennedy challenged Carter, don't forget. So it's not totally impossible. And, it's a nice instinct to be sympathetic to him, but I judge him by what he does. And I don't accept this argument that the Iranian election was a setback, obviously. I mean, it goes without saying, and I make the point in my book. But one episode like that can't totally derail a policy if the policy is already there. Look, on Cuba, they haven't been able to move a tiny bloody thing, which many of their own supporters now are telling them to lift the siege on Cuba. Don't do it. It's continuity. With the Bush administration.
I was almost going to say I'm going to do the devil's advocate, but actually I'm going to be your friend's advocate for a moment. You keep you're a writer and a public speaker, but you keep downplaying speech and framing the conversation. Obama did succeed, didn't he? I mean, yes, he did. I mean, he was for a long time, and you actually quote that article that says the most important things 2009 were his 5 speeches and so on and so forth. But framing the conversation in a different way, whether it is with the Islamic world, whether it's with the Bolivarian states, whether it's with Asia, and so on and so forth, that is essential, isn't it?
But as there were other presidents in the past too who did all this, as I cite, Woodrow Wilson being one of them. invading countries with one hand and preaching peace or offering an olive branch with the other. It's not an exactly new phenomenon in American politics. And some of them are better at it than others. And I'm saying that that is essentially what is going on. That it's not the speech I underplay, it's I compare the speech with actions related to that speech. And whenever you do that, you find...
But you're saying it's deterministic?
I'm saying that you never judge a politician by what he says or she says. Never. That should just be a basic principle. You judge them by what they do. And that is how you judge Clinton, and that is how you judge Carter, that is how you judge most American presidents, or every American president, and this guy's no exception.
Oops, sorry.
Tariq, I remember that you once described yourself as a libertarian Marxist. Now, in that context, do you think that the collapse of world capitalism will have significant effects on the United States? In particular, you said there is no left. What prospects are there for the rebuilding of the left in the world situation with the loss of American international power over a time and the growth of alternative powers? I particularly mentioned the point about Marxism because you've been concentrating on an individual, which seems to be slightly contradictory to a Marxist analysis of social forces rather than individuals.
But they're all defending that individual. That's why I'm saying that what people are saying about him, this whole wave of mania which swept the world, Obama, 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 is precisely because we live in a consumerist world and a celebrity world where the politics becomes secondary to what is being seen, and that is what I challenged. But I've been explaining this whole evening what the economic crisis is in the United States, what needs to be done about it. And by the way, it's not a question, I have no time for Soros, I made that perfectly clear, but I'm saying when even people like him, who are very much in favor of this system and have gained from it, make certain rational criticisms, they can't be ignored. In fact, are taken far more seriously than by the likes of you and me in the White House and Wall Street. So one can't just, one shouldn't not listen to them simply because we don't agree with them when they're making points which are of interest. But, your point that if the world capitalist system collapses, well, it's never happened in such a way before, and it's not going to happen. There is no such thing as the final crisis of capitalism unless there is a political and social force prepared to move and build on that collapse and build something else. There is absolutely no sign of that in any of the major countries. Now, what happens if a system comes close to collapse? It is not the case historically that the country automatically moves to the left. In fact, the exact opposite can happen. It is happening in Europe today. The parties that are gaining from the crisis are not the parties of the left, but the parties of the right and the extreme right. They're burning Romas, gypsies in Italy. They're expelling them in France. There's a whole wave of Islamophobia spreading throughout Europe, where the same language is being used about Muslims today as was being used about Jews in the 20s and 30s and 40s. That's what's going on. So there's no automatic mechanical thing, hurrah, hurrah, there's a big crisis and things will move left. Things do not move left automatically. In fact, to be frank with you, the left does better out of it in normal times than times of crisis, when people can think more. So that's not the case. Secondly, American military power is nowhere near collapsing. Their economic power has been on the wane for the last 25 years. But they make up for it often by using their military strength. The American military power today is the strongest it's ever been on a global scale. The strongest it's ever been. And any American president who comes in is not just the president of the United States, he's the president of this empire that they have. And that is what he has to do. I mean, I have no illusions about that.
We're going to need to wrap it up. You want to do just a counter? Go ahead, please.
If I could just... I mean, Soros, Gary Wills had the absolute key idea in this when he said that actually Obama is up against the War Powers Act from 1941. So since 1941, America's been building a world military establishment. And if he had 36 years in the presidency, he couldn't dismember it. There's a vast bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And that is actually what he's dealing with. So we have to measure him against that.
But you can measure every president against that.
But
why just him?
But he's
yeah, he's president now. You can mention, you know, the question is what you do actually goes to strengthen that empire and not weaken it. That's the big point. And in my opinion, that is what he's doing. And you have to educate the American public too. And that is what he's not doing.
Tariq, I would like to end just on a macro note, if you could help us. So we agree that America is in decline, at least vis-a-vis the other powers in the world. And at the same time, the American military is nowhere near decline, anyway, in terms of its size and so on and so forth. So do you think there's a correlation between a failing presidency and a declining empire today?
You know, sometimes you can have very strong leaders, political leaders, at a moment when the country is in decline. I mean, look at Britain under Churchill. Very strong war leader, very strong political leader, British Empire declining. Look at France, de Gaulle, probably the most tough-minded leader France has had, at a time when the French Empire was declining, over which he presided and actually ended that empire. So you need a strong leader to make necessary, moves in that direction.
And your verdict, Obama has been downsizing empire or has been expanding?
I don't think. I think under the, it's the same as under Bush, as under Clinton, as under Bush Senior. Nothing has changed as far as the American empire is concerned. It remains in place. Where it's been challenged is not militarily. Essentially, the situation we have today in the world is it's like a concert of powers. Most of the big powers, when it comes to the push, never really challenge the United States, whether it's the European Union or Russia or even the Chinese. Very rarely have they used a veto in the Security Council. They threatened to on the Iraq War because they had Germany and France with them. So they didn't go through the UN for that thing. So it's not I am one of those who is not convinced by the argument that the American empire is on the decline. It may well be so by the end of the century, but the signs at the moment are not in that direction.
On this sobering note, we thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tariq. And maybe we should get less sober